Hi there, Lindsay here, the Frugal Crafter. Today we're going to paint this landscape in gouache paint, and if you would like a real-time version of this tutorial, you can find it in Critique Club. I will link to that down below, along with dozens and dozens of other real-time, more advanced tutorials if you're interested. You can find out more about that in the link below. We're going to start off using, it's actually watercolor paper that's been adhered to a hard panel and then sealed, and I had this panel kicking around for a couple of years. It was sent to me from a company that no longer is in business, so I figured I'm just gonna play around on this. I wanted something that I could just be kind of free and have fun with and experiment with, and I think it's good to do paintings like that once in a while. Now, I've spent quite a bit of time out in nature this week, kayaking and paddleboarding and walking and just kind of resetting, just kind of refilling my creative battery, I guess. And I just wanted to capture some of those colors, and I thought it would be just a nice type of project to do in gouache. I'm using some very inexpensive paintbrushes. You can use whatever brushes you would typically use for acrylic paint with gouache. And in fact, this painting could be done with acrylics with no problem whatsoever. I think it would be great in gouache or acrylic paint. Now, I'm going for a real painterly look here in the sky, so while the paint's still wet, I'm putting in my clouds, I'm letting the colors mix, and I'm using a couple different shades of blue. I'm kind of mixing them together so they harmonize as I'm going. Now, I really wanted to use some ultramarine blue in the sky, but this gouache set does not have ultramarine blue, and this is the gouache set that I actually prefer and I have in my office. So I just kind of grabbed it and started to play. Since I do have kind of like a, it looks like a mid ultramarine, it's kind of like a periwinkle color, I could add that to the Prussian blue and get a very good approximation of the color that I needed. So just make sure if you're going to be mixing a bunch of colors or using a bunch of colors that you try to mix them throughout your painting so that you create some nice harmony. Now, I've got some mountains in the background and I want a bit of a purpley undertone to them. So I'm using some magenta with that Prussian blue to give me that cool purpley hazy color that I want. And I'm also going to use that magenta in some unusual ways throughout the painting. I'm finishing up the just the outline of the mountain with my brush. I wanted to just kind of almost block it in before I go in with some textural effects with my palette knife. Now, the set of brushes that I'm using came with a palette knife. I typically don't use a palette knife with gouache because you don't want to have really thick applications with gouache because it does not have a strong binder in it like acrylic paint does. So if you're using acrylics, go ahead, slather that paint on thick and don't worry about it. But with gouache, you really want to be careful that you don't have any thick passages because it can flake off. Since I'm working on a rigid support, I don't have to worry about the flaking quite as much. I don't want really big, really thick passages, but this is not going to bend like it would in a sketchbook. And that's really where you have the issues with thick passages of gouache paint. It just doesn't have that flexible binder like acrylic. So when you turn the pages of the sketchbook, you could end up having it flake off. Now, one thing I do want to mention, if you're using gouache on a canvas or a canvas panel, you need to have a proper ground. And I mean not an acrylic ground. Now, this panel that I got actually, I think, had any acrylic gesso on there, even though it was supposed to be for watercolor. And I did end up with some flaking problems at the end. So you want to make sure if you are going to use a hard panel, I think there's like a motorcycle going by, so I apologize for that noise. If you are going to use a hard panel, I recommend that you still prime it with watercolor ground, and that's available from various companies. I've used the Daniel Smith one. I know Golden makes one, and probably some other companies too, but just get one that's specifically designed for watercolors. Even though it's gouache and not watercolor, essentially the properties of the paint are the same. They have gum arabic as a binder, and they just need that extra tooth and that extra adhesion that a watercolor ground will provide. So keep that in mind, because I don't want you to spend a lot of time on a painting and realize that you painted on something that you're not going to have proper binding. Now, I'm doing I'm using the fan brush that came in that brush roll because it was handy. It was there to do my trees. Now, you can do a painting with just one or two brushes. There's nothing wrong with that. But the nice thing about having a variety of brushes is that you can keep yourself from getting really similar brush strokes. You can get a variety of brush strokes, even if your technique is kind of similar. So that is kind of a nice thing. And I'm just using the fan brush on its edge. You could definitely use a flat brush on its edge for this. You don't need to have that special brush. But if you got it, give it a try. Try those weird brushes that you have in your stash that you don't know what to do with. You're not going to hurt them with gouache, guys. that's absolutely not going to hurt any of you could take your oil painting brushes and use them with gouache. It's not going to hurt those brushes one single bit, because you always have to wash your oil painting brushes with soap and water when you're done. Now, if you weren't so hot about cleaning your oil painting brushes before you used them with gouache, you could deposit some oils on your painting, but honestly, I've never had it happen because I wash my brushes well. You, of course, can be the best judgment of your brush hygiene and whatnot, but I want to encourage you to experiment, because you know what? That's how we learn stuff. You don't fail in art, guys. You never fail in art. You either succeed or you learn something new that you didn't know before about your products. Like, I learned that this art board that I used was not suitable for for watercolor and gouache as I was using it, but hey, I learned something, and that's valuable, and I had fun, and because this board wasn't precious to me, I was pretty sure the company wasn't still in business. I didn't have to, worry about reviewing it in some future time. I was just feeling like I wanted to have fun, and honestly, I was probably going to work in a sketchbook if I didn't work in this, but I wanted something bigger than my sketchbook. And this one's about 11 by 15. So it is a little bit larger than any of the sketchbooks that I currently have. Now I'm just layering up more shades of green. Now, another thing that I will say about this set that I'm not too keen on is the greens are all a little overmixed, I think. So they're not as vibrant and as pure when you're working with an opaque medium, you are going to have that to an extent, because they do have opacifiers in them, because it's gouache and it's meant to be opaque. So you do deal with that a little bit, but I was finding that a little frustrating. I probably would have had better luck using a limited supply of like my open acrylics or even my tube gouache. Now, I do want to touch on one more thing about gouache, and that is a Lightfast issue. Now, people are always asking me, is it Lightfast? Is it Lightfast? And when I'm dealing with a budget product like these jelly gouaches, I'm never going to say they're probably Lightfast, because the gouache was originally designed for reproduction, so it didn't need to last hung in direct sunlight. It was more used in the advertising industry. It was used to quickly render something, so you don't have to wait for like layers of oil paint to dry. It can give you kind of that look of oil paint, but very quickly. And Lightfastness was not necessarily a concern. The concern was, can it reproduce for magazine work and for poster work and things like that. So it was never a real big issue. So most gouaches were not Lightfast. Even your artist grade gouaches, like your Winsor Newton, wasn't Lightfast. So I wasn't really concerned, but lately people are really exploring the artistic abilities of gouache and how wonderful it is to paint with it. So now people are like, hey, I want this to last. I want this to be Lightfast. So what I would recommend is buying individual tubes and not a set if you are concerned about Lightfastness. And the brands that I would recommend checking out if you want Lightfast gouache would be M. Graham and Schmincke. And I would buy individual tubes, and on the tubes it will tell you what their Lightfast rating is, and those would both be rated. M. Graham would be rated by ASTM, and I think that Schmincke may be ASTM and Blue Wool Scale rated. So, you can pretty well trust their ratings. They are very reputable companies, and that's what I would do. And go with a limited palette of your, bright primary colors so you can mix everything you need. And that will keep your expense down too, and then you can just kind of buy a tube as you run out. So that would be my advice if you're really concerned with Lightfastness. But as you probably know, if you've ever bought artist grade paint, that like probably 2 or 3 tubes is going to cost you more than that set of 24 colors. So it just depends on if you're using in a sketchbook, you can use the cheaper stuff. If you want to hang your work on the wall in direct sunlight, you probably want to spring for the more expensive gouache, but you don't need so many colors because you can definitely mix it. So just kind of keep that in mind if you're considering shopping for gouache. If you have any questions, you can ask them in the comments. I'll help you if I can. I've used the M. Graham brand gouache, and it's really nice. I tend not to, I do have little pans of it, but they do, even the artist stuff will dry and crack in the pan, so I'd probably use it fresh from the tube. Maybe use it in a ceramic palette like I have here, and give it a spritz of water, as you want to reuse it, but I wouldn't fill full pans and do it that way. It can be a little rough on your brushes when you have to reconstitute it. Although I have let them dry out before and use that for travel just because it's lighter. So you can do whatever you want. That's just my advice after using these for a few years, what I recommend. Now, as you can see, I did underpainting with magenta. Basically, I just kind of sketched stuff out with the magenta, so little peaks of that color can jump out and kind of make other colors seem poppier happier and vibrate more. And that's why I like to do that. I also like to sketch with a red color erase pencil in my sketchbook because I like those little hints of red kind of jumping out at you. I think it really helps with landscape work, or like doing a landscape painting on red paper if you're working with pastel, or with gouache. You could use red mat board. I do that sometimes for gouache underpaintings. So have fun with it. Play with your colors and see what sort of effects you can create. It doesn't seem discordant. It seems exciting, and the reason for that is we used that pink when we mixed our mountain color, and it's an opposite of the green that we have going there. So, and it's one color. It's not like I'm picking out a bunch of different random colors and just adding them in willy-nilly. When you do that, I think it makes the work look a little bit unprofessional, but you don't know what will work until you try it. So be kind to yourself and experiment and play with your paints, and use those cheap paints in your sketchbook so you're not worried about wasting expensive things and you're not worried about it being precious, and have fun and see what you can create. I'm playing with the palette knife here, and I find that I can smush it, like kind of smack it down onto the canvas and get some almost granite textures. Of course, be careful on the surface you're using that your paint's not going to flake off, but it's kind of a fun way to get some texture. You could actually even go in, like if you're using this in a sketchbook, gouache bonds so well to paper. If you're using this in a sketchbook, and even if you just have mild texture, you can go over it with colored pencil and get it will pick up those beautiful textures that you've laid down. Or you can go over it with pastel. If you're going over it with pastel, you would want to frame it under glass. If you're going to do a ton of pastel, I probably wouldn't do it in a sketchbook, but you could do oil pastel, or you could do, like I mentioned, colored pencil or pastel pencil, and grab those textures, really make them pronounced, and not have the flaking issue by putting the gouache on too thick. Now, something you want to keep in mind as you're working is your values. It's how light or dark things are. And I'm going in here and I'm actually using black, and I'm going to use the black throughout the picture. So if I was just going to put black in for a final shadow and do nothing else, that might be a little weird looking. It would look kind of collagey, like I just kind of cut out black bits and stuck them down. But because I'm going back, I'm mixing it with some green, I'm mixing it into the trees, it's going to work and it's going to harmonize. One thing I do want to warn you, when you're doing your dark values, if you're using black, when you first put it down, see how right now it looks like, wow, that's way too black, Lindsay, that does not look right. That's because your gouache paint, your darker colors in gouache, while it's wet, look way darker than they're going to dry out to. So just if you're starting to freak out a little bit, walk away, let it dry, and then come back, and you will see it will look fine. Trust me. It just looks extra dark when it's glossy. Matte colors look lighter. So when these blacks, these dark shadows that you've mixed, when it dries, it's going to look fine. If you want a really black, take that black, mix it with your Prussian blue. That's going to cool it down and make it extra dark. So it's funny, you just cool the temperature down of a color, it all of a sudden looks darker, it looks more far away, it looks crisper. And I want those shadows at the bottom of the rocks because wet rocks are darker, and that's going to help separate the rocks from the water a little bit and get that kind of wet look to the bottom of the rocks, because everything's going to be matte. You're not going to have glossiness there that will show where things have been, like it's not going to make the rocks look wet because of glossiness. Now I'm going in and I kind of dabbed on some white gouache where the white water would be splashing, the water would be splashing against the rocks, just to give it a little bit of that movement and that brightness. There's really not a lot of blue in the water. When we kind of put it down heavy to begin with because we needed that contrast when we went to put in our white in. We needed something for the black to mix into, and that's the thing with gouache. It's so nice is that your painting surfaces can always be reactivated. So you can go back in and you can mix back into those previous colors. So if you're doing this with acrylics and you're like, oh shoot, my water dried, I can't get it to mix back, you're just going to need to do a little more palette mixing than on the canvas mixing. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're using acrylics. I recently discovered the open acrylics by Golden, and I found for my style, I really like them. And I don't have a ton of them. I bought the 2 starter sets of, I think it's 5 or 6 colors. I think it's 5. I started with the modern colors because I do like those more bright modern colors, and then I got the traditional colors, and I think those are really great sets to start with and see if you like the paint, because there's enough in either of those sets of 5 or 6. Gosh, I can't remember how many, but there's enough in those sets that you can mix what you need to mix. And then like what I'll be doing is I'll be adding tubes as I need it, basically, because they are expensive, and I tend to work in a more limited palette when I'm painting. I like having this big set of gouache because I actually use it for gel printing, and I use it, I'll just grab some like light acrylic or matte medium or Mod Podge or something to use for adhesion for my gel printing, but I like to use that gouache for my gel printing because it gives me so many colors right in a small footprint on my table, because I run out of so much space when I'm gel printing that it just really it really works out well for my technique. Now, that rock back there kind of bugged me. I love painting rocks, as you know. If you've watched my YouTube channel for any amount of time, you know how much I love painting rocks. I don't even think I'm much of a landscape painter. I like to paint the rocks, and that's pretty much where my interest lies. So I can't let the rocks just be a blob in the background. I gotta get that, that rough texture. And to me, that's the most beautiful part of the landscape, is the rocks. And I'm not the rocks and flowers, man. I think that's why I like kayaking so much, because I can kayak out and be kind of nestled in between a few rocks and paint some rocks with some little, those little lavender flowers that pop up in July. I can paint those little lavendery looking flowers that pop up, and those little lilies, and all nestled around the rocks, because to me, there's just nothing more beautiful than the main granite in the landscape. I do not have granite countertops. I like my granite outside in the landscape. I just think it's so pretty. I decided I needed a couple closer trees, kind of either growing with at the edge of those rocks or right behind the rocks. So I'm going in and I'm using black actually to put in the trunks. And then I am tapping in some of the different greens right straight from, the paint is going straight from the palette cup, but it is paint that I have pulled out into my palette at some point or another, and I am mixing it with some of the yellows that I had used just to brighten them up a little bit. But I felt like I needed something growing in the mid-range of my painting, because I have the inorganic rocks, I have the water, and then I have trees in the far distance and mountains in the far distance, but I felt like I needed something that was alive, and I didn't have any flowers in there or anything in that mid-range. So then I let this dry for a couple hours, because I didn't know if I liked the painting. I didn't know what I was feeling about this painting at that point, and I kind of didn't think I was liking it. But when I came back a couple hours later, I'm like, you know what? This really doesn't need too much, and I'm glad I didn't push through, because if I had, I know I would have overworked it. What I thought I wanted to do at this point was, I thought I was going to need to brighten up the trees with more yellow and green, but then I'm like, no, I need the magenta. The magenta is perfect for this, because magenta, this pinkish red, is the opposite of a yellowy green kind of color. So I just added little sparks of that in between the branches. I decided to add a little teeny bit, not too much in the faraway trees, just a little bit for some vibration, and a little bit on the horizon there. I didn't want to pull that forward. I wanted that to stay in the background. And mainly, I really wanted to kind of add some sparks of that magenta around my rocks, because I loved the look of them, those little sparks of magenta poking through and peeking and kind of winking at you. I just like that. And I'm like, you know what? Yeah, let's have some magenta winks here and there. And really, that's about all I needed to do. I did adjust a little bit of the values at this stage, but I didn't feel like it needed much. And it's really important that you let your painting dry before you decide you're completely done with it, because of the fact that probably at the end you're putting in some bright highlights, and you're probably putting in some dark shadows. And your highlights, it's funny, the highlights are going to dry more opaque. So if you're putting in white and you're adding white, maybe thin down a little bit here and there, when it dries, it'll stand out more. And when your darks dry, they will mellow out a little bit. So it's hard to really objectively see your painting until it's dry. So, and plus you give your eyes a little break, and then the little painting fairies come in and they do their magic. They sprinkle on their little fairy dust, and they get your painting looking real sweet. And then when you come back, you look at it the next day, you're like, that's pretty good. I'm a pretty good painter. Because our little painting elves have come in the night and done their thing. And it's just really important to get away from your work every once in a while and just let it be. I really enjoyed painting this. It was really fun to go through and kind of take a really ordinary photo, and then and just kind of put my my spin on it. I purposely went for a reference photo that wasn't super detailed, that wasn't super had a lot going on, because I wanted to be able to put my personality into it and do my thing. And I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it inspires you to give it a try too. I'll link the reference photo down below. I'll also put the link to Critique Club in case you're interested in the full real-time tutorial for this painting. And I thank you so much for watching. Please get out there, do some painting this summer, and as always, happy crafting.